Okay. So when you get in here, you'll want to download SQLite Expert. I'm going to get the 64-bit version of that. Oh, actually, that is the wrong one. I don't want professional. Professional is the paid version. I want the personal version. So once you get that downloaded, I'll then run the installer. We're going to say run anyway. Yes. Accept. Go ahead and run that. Okay, I just take all the defaults for that. Yeah, it should be there. Yeah. So once you get SQLite Expert installed, make sure it's the personal version, because the personal version is free. The professional version is only a 30-day trial. So once you get that successfully installed, please just post something into YouTube Live, the YouTube chat, so that I know that we're ready to go. So SQLite Expert, this isn't the only tool that can do this. This is the tool that I've used for the past several years. It's kind of your management studio, if you will, SQL Server Management Studio, but for SQLite. So this will let you create, edit, view, manage databases. But you do have to have them as a local file on your computer. So what that means is if you have a database on your device, you'll need to download that from your that database file from your device first so you can view it. It won't be able to directly view it from your Android device. Now, one thing I know already from the emulators, there is a way to pull down the database. I'll have to go back and look up where that is. I know it's in Android Studio somewhere. However, if you're running on a physical device, you will not be able to pull down that database file. It won't let you. Reason being, in order to get into internal storage, which is where the database is stored, and download that file, you have to be a super user. So you don't have super user permissions on your physical devices. They're not rooted. So because they're not rooted, you will not be able to pull the SQLite databases off of your physical device. You will be able to pull it off the emulators, but not your physical tablets, because they're not rooted. Okay, so what we want to do here first to kind of get started is I'm going to create a new database. So if you look up on the top, there's a few different buttons. Okay, so we can say new in-memory database. So this is going to just create it in SQL like Expert. It's just going to have it kind of in memory, but not actually save it to a file. But I want to end actually creating a file with this example. So I'm going to hit new database here, which is the leftmost icon. Okay. Now I need to call it a name, and I'm just going to save it. Let's save it to my projects folder, so I have a copy of this. So I'm going to go into my projects folder. There we go. Okay. So let's make a new folder. We'll call this SQLite example. Although actually I've got an examples folder, so I'll put it there. New folder, SQLite example database. All right, and we will call this, I can just call this example.db. So we're going to call this example.db. I'm going to save it into my examples folder. Okay. So now we have an empty example.db. Okay. This created the DB file. If I were to actually look on disk, let me open up that folder, we can see that it's there. Examples. There we go. So there's the database file. Okay. Now, if you try to double click it, it's not going to know what app to open it in. So that may be one thing that you want to change. You may want to change what application is assigned to open these DB files. So I believe you can change that in the options. So if I go to Tool Options, and then I go down to File Associations, I can check these boxes. So I'm going to check DB, DB3, and SQLite. Yep. There we go. Okay. So now those boxes are checked. I'm going to hit OK. So again, that was the way I got there was Tools, Options, and then this was File Associations. So if I check those boxes and hit OK, what that's going to allow me to do then is directly open these files by double clicking them. So if I close SQL Expert, I double click this file now, You can see now I can open those DB files directly from double clicking them on the in File Explorer. So that's helpful. Okay. Now, if I want to add a table to this, because right now I have an empty database with no tables, what I need to do is go up here, and I'm going to say, right-click on the example database here, and I'm going to say New Table. Okay, it's going to give me a little window like this. I need to first give it a table name. So let's kind of follow along with what we did on the slides. I'm going to call this the word list table. Okay, so this is the word list table. I'm going to leave those boxes as is. So that's the name. It's under the General tab. I now need to go into the Columns tab, and I need to start adding columns. So first we want to add an ID column, so that's going to be _ID. The type of that column will be integer. Okay. The default value, I don't need to set any of those there. I do want to mark it as not null. And that's it. I just need to give it the name and the type. Okay. Let's add the next column. So the next column is going to be the word column. And this is going to be type text. And this is also going to be not null. And I'm going to add the third column, which is definition. So the type of that one is also going to be text. Not null. Okay. Now, this has queued up those three columns to be added, and we're going to queued the table up to be added. It hasn't happened yet. Okay, so all the changes that I make here don't happen until I hit this apply button. By the way, don't hit it yet. What we want to do before we create the table is we need to make sure it has a primary key. So I haven't done that yet. So I've gone through general, I gave it a name, I went through columns and created the three columns. So ID is an integer, word is text, definition is text. I now need to go to the primary key tab and add the primary key here. So I'm going to go add. The column name is ID, and we're going to mark it as auto increment. Okay. If you don't check the auto increment box when you add it here, you're actually going to have to delete the primary key and recreate it. So we want to go ahead and hit OK there. All right, so we have a primary key that's set to auto increment. Now that I've done those three things, I've given it a name, I've added the columns with their types, and I've added a primary key, I can finally hit apply. Okay. Now that I've hit apply, you'll notice that there is the word list table is up there and created. Now, font size is a little bit small. Let's see if I can go change. By the way, here. I'm going to go increase the font size. Maybe just 150. Because I can't really increase, otherwise the text is kind of small in here. Okay. So that is our database, our table created. If I go back to general, same thing here. So there's a few tabs here where this is all under the design tab. That's how we design the schema of the database. There's also some other tabs up here that I can use. So let me go back up to database. Okay, this is settings that are core to the database as a whole. Let me go into data. Data is now going to be available based on which table I have selected. So data is going to show me the actual data inside of the table. Go to tools at the top to increase font size. Well, let's do that. actually, there's one here. Okay, there we go. That should be better. I hope everybody can see that now. Okay, so the data tab is where we're going to actually look at the data that's in the table. The DDL tab will actually give us the SQL that we need to create this table. So you can see it says create table, word list table. It's got the ID column, the word column, and the definition column. There we go. And you can see the primary key, auto increment. It's marked all three of those as not null. So once you get done with creating these tables, this is actually really helpful to have that DDL because that create table statement we'll actually need when we go into Android Studio to create the table. We'll need to have that create table statement. So this helps us build it and design it a little bit, which can be helpful. So that's where we're starting. Okay. Next thing I'm going to do is go back. So we looked at design. That was how to design it. There's also a SQL tag here. We'll come back to this in a minute. The SQL tab lets me actually write and run queries from within SQLite Expert. So yeah, you're asking about whether is auto increment similar to the identity. It's basically the same thing, almost. It just always starts at 1 and always increments by 1. So it automatically kind of assign an ID to each entry in there. So I won't specify, when I'm inserting rows, I won't specify what the ID is. It'll automatically assign the next ID by incrementing. So let's go back to data. So I'm going to start creating rows. So first I'm going to click in here. Oh, no, I need to click the Insert Record button. Okay. I'm going to leave the ID blank. In Word, I'm going to type in alpha. Let's make this bigger so I can see what I'm typing. So alpha, first letter. I'm going to hit enter on this, and it's going to go ahead and save the row. Okay, there's my first row. So let's go enter the next one, which is, I need a plus, beta, and, oh, I tabbed out. Okay, so second letter, enter, add a third row, and I'm going to put in alpha particle. Okay. So now I have 3 rows in the table. Okay. Is everybody tracking? Is everybody at this point? So now that I've entered some data, I can go over to the SQL tab and start writing SQL statements and test them here to make sure that they work. And that also allows me to kind of test them outside of the space of Android without all the Android tools set up. So select star from word list table. So we're going to just list all the data. I'll start here. And I'm going to say execute SQL. Cool. So there is the output of that statement. If I want to say, well, let's just give me some of the data. So I'm going to say where word is alpha. There we go. So I've got the first row and the third row because those ones contain alpha. Or I could say, well, let's give me the ones that contain letter. So I might say definition like % letter. So anything that ends in letter. And that would give me those results. So that's kind of the gist of what you can do with SQLite Expert. And that's kind of our manager, our SQLite manager that we can work with the database in more of a graphical sort of environment. Okay. Any more questions about this tool? So if you're still saying null here, you need to push enter to go ahead and save it. So now that we've got that, I want to go back to Android Studio, and we'll start hooking something up to basically use this database. So I'm going to throw this over to the side. I'm going to go into Android Studio, and we're going to start a new Android Studio project. Okay, so I'm going to start it from an empty activity. It's going to be a very simple application. I want to go to my project folder. There we go. Okay, so our examples. Okay, so I'm in my examples folder. I'm going to call this SQLite example. That did not do what I wanted it to do. Try that again, because that created it in the wrong folder. Let's open an existing project that I have. Okay. File, new project. Let's try that again. So I want to go to examples. Okay. SQLite example. I was trying to add that to the end of my URL, in my save location. Okay, so example, SQLite example. All right, let's go ahead and hit finish there. Okay, that's booting up. So I need to create a class for my database and for my rows. So first I'm going to create the class for the rows, and then we'll come back and we'll create the class for the database. So I'm going to create a new Java class, and we're going to call this our word class. Okay. Now the word class needs to have a few properties. So we're going to model it off of the database that we just created. So it's going to have 3 columns: a ID column, a word column, and a definition column. So private int ID, and I'm going to leave the underscores and the m's off just to make this generate better. It's kind of what we usually do for models or view models. That's that way Android Studio suggests it in a better way. So private int ID string word private string definition. Okay, so I've got 3 instance variables that are going to store my data for each word in the word list. And then I need to generate a constructor and some getters and setters. So I'm going to select the class. I'm going to select that word up top. And what I want to do is right-click, generate, and then I'm going to generate a few different things. So I'm going to generate a constructor first. Okay, I need to pick all 3 of those columns because I want it to construct the object with those 3 things initially. So I'm going to add that in here. And then I'm also going to add in the getters and the setters. So right click here, go back to generate, and we're going to generate getters and setters. I want to select all 3 of these. So it's going to generate a getter and a setter for each. There we go. So we have getters for a getter for our ID, we have a setter for our ID, we have getter for our word, setter for our word, getter for our definition, setter for our definition. So that's our word class. So by using those tools to auto-generate those methods, that's going to save us a lot of work. Rather than having to write all of those out by hand, which gets tedious, because most of the time it's just going to be the same thing. Get ID, set ID, yada, 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 yada. So that means that really all the code you have to write is just, here's the instance variables I want to have, and then you can have it generate the rest of the code for you. Okay, so that will make it a lot easier to make these model classes. We'll need those. We're going to need this one today for all the stuff we do with Room coming up in 10.1. We'll need to create entities like this as well. So keep this in your back pocket, because the same thing that we just did now is something that we're going to keep doing. Okay. So that's our word class. The next thing I need to create is our database class. So I'm going to create a new Java class. And let's call this the word list database. Not really a creative name, but I'm going to go ahead and use that. Okay. Now, what I want to do here is a few things that weren't really on the slides. They're not really in the material for this chapter. For whatever reason, it just kind of gives you a broad overview of how things work, but it doesn't really tell you how to build an application with the SQLite database. Okay, so what I want to do here is this class is going to be a subclass of not. You might think it, well, this should probably be a subclass of something like SQLite database, which should be a reasonable assumption. The way it works is actually a little bit different. So there's sort of this wrapper class that we're going to extend that will deal with creating the database and then also doing updates to the database if we need to do schema changes down the road. So it actually deals with those 2 things. So we need to use that wrapper first, And that wrapper then will create the actual SQL database object, SQLite database object. So the name of that class, I'm going to say extends SQLite open helper. You're going to see it turn red. You can see it's already picked up Android database, SQLite, SQL open helper. That's good. And I'm going to hit Alt Enter because I need to implement some methods. Okay, so if I go in here, it's going to show me that I need to implement the onCreate method as well as the onUpgrade method. Okay. I also know that I'm going to need to create a constructor. So my constructor is going to be public. We'll call it wordless database, same as the class name. And then I need to take in a context. Okay, so that's going to take in a context, and we're going to call the SuperClass, super constructor, with some information. Okay, now if we look at SQL Open Helper, if we look at the constructor here, we can see that there's a few different versions of that constructor. Okay, so which version do I want to use? Well, the version I'm going to use is the top one here. Let's go take a look at it. So it needs a few things. It needs a context, which I've taken in as a parameter. It's going to need a name, which is the name of the database file. It's also going to need potentially a cursor factory. We're actually going to pass in null to just use the default cursor factory. And then it needs a version number. So that version number tells it what version of the schema is it. And that it uses that to determine if the version of the schema that's already on the device is new or old, or where it currently sits at. Okay, so if your schema changes, you'll need to update that version. Okay, so right now we're going to start at version 1. It always starts at version 1 for your first version of the schema. Okay, so we're going to pass in the constructor. We're going to pass in the context. Next, I need the name of the database file. So I'm going to make a constant for that. Private static final database name. And that is going to be example.db. Oh, I need to define that is a string. Okay, so that's our name of our database file. It's going to be example.db. That will be stored into internal storage. So super database name, null for the cursor refactory, and then 1 for the database version. Now typically we'll make that database version a constant as well. So I'm going to go ahead and add that here. Private static file int database version is equal to 1. So there's my database version, my database name, and my database version. Okay. So that's how we need to set up the constructor. Okay, so we need to call that base class constructor to tell it what's the name of the file and what is the version of the database currently, or what would we like it to upgrade it to. Okay, now that we've created that, we need to put some logic into the onCreate. The onCreate is going to get called initially when we need to create the database file. So that's where we're going to put our logic to create all the tables that we need. OnUpgrade gets called later on. If we say we update to a newer version of Android, a newer version with a different schema, that's where we're going to call upgrade. But for now, we can leave that blank because there's nothing to upgrade. So we're going to just put all of our, I can just put a comment in there, and I'm going to go into onCreate, and we need to add in the logic to create our word list table. So here I'm going to say db.exec SQL. Remember we talked about raw query. Raw query allows us to run any sort of select query that we want, but it's not the statement that we'll use for any other. We can only use it for select statements. So exec SQL lets us run any other kind of SQL statement. Okay. So I need to create build up a statement to create that table here. Okay. Now, if I look at SQLite Expert, remember when we went to DDL, it gave us all the code we needed to create the table. Okay, so I'm going to borrow that code. I'm going to take all the code that's here and bring it in. Okay, now I'm going to paste it in between these parentheses. You want to make sure you have the parentheses there first before you paste it in. And when you do that, it will then go automatically break it into multiple lines. Okay, and do Shift Tab to clean this up a bit. Now, we don't actually need the new lines in there like added. So I can actually go to the end and remove all of those, as we don't need all that extra space in the SQL. There we go. Now, one thing you may notice immediately as we started putting that in, notice it's actually doing some syntax highlighting on your SQL. It has actually recognized that this in here is a SQL statement. And as such, it's gone ahead and started to format that. You can see the keywords are bold there. And it's going ahead and making the rest black. But you can see it in green that it's recognized that this is SQL. It'll actually potentially give you some syntax errors, some warnings if your syntax isn't exactly correct. So that's great. So that's all we need to do to put into our onCreate, at least to create the table. Now, we also want there to be some data there. Okay, so if I leave this as is, when I initially run the application, I won't have any data. So I need to add in some additional statements in here to add the data. So db exec SQL, I'm going to write an insert statement. So that starts with insert, need parentheses, need quotes. So insert, I'm going to insert into the word list table, and then values, I can specify what values I want to insert in there. Okay, so let's see. The first row is alpha, and looking at the data that we had, should be first letter. And then I'm going to duplicate that twice because I need to insert 3 rows. So word list table, I'm going to insert alpha. We're going to insert beta, which is second letter. And then I'm going to have alpha, which is particle. And you should notice here that I'm leaving off the ID because it will automatically get determined because it's an auto increment column. If this wasn't auto increment, then I would have to specify the ID. But because it's auto increment, I don't. So now that we've got the logic in there to create the database, I now want to add some logic in to now be able to query the database. Okay, so let's add another method. Public list word. And I call this get all words. So this is going to retrieve all of the words that are in the database so that I can potentially display them in the UI. Okay. So let's here, we need some SQL first. So string query is equal to select underscore ID. What do you mean change the name of the ID on the model? No, that will be fine. I don't need to call it underscore ID on the model for this. So I'm going to say select that from the word list table. Okay. That's my SQL. Now, you'll notice it hasn't done any syntax highlighting yet. It won't do the syntax highlighting until I actually start using it to run a SQL query. So first, let's go ahead and create a list. This is going to be list of words. Or maybe I call this results is equal to a new list of words. Actually, I can leave that off. Oh, this needs to be an array list, not a list. So array list, enter, there we go. So we've got a new array list, and then I can start populating that list. So let's open up the cursor first. So try cursor is equal to, oh, I need the database object. So in order to get the database object, I need to call a method. So this dot get, I need to get the readable database. So SQLite database db is equal to get readable database. So get readable database gives me a db object where I can just do reads. Get writable database gives me an object where I can do both reads and writes. The reason for the distinction is that it allows better kind of working where if you're working with different things that are happening at the same time. So if you get a writable database, you're more like you're going to block other things from happening, whereas if you get readable database, then multiple reads can happen at once. So in there, I need to now say db dot raw query. We're going to give it that query. We're going to pass in null. Now, at this point, now that I've called raw query with the SQL, you'll notice that it's now done the syntax highlighting. Now that I've actually used it to call raw query, Android Studio said, oh, okay, that must be a SQL statement. So now it's evaluating it as such. Okay. So now inside of the try, now that I've got an open cursor to read the data, I will go through each of those rows in the result set and turn that into a Word object. So in here, I'm going to say while cursor dot move to next. We're going to start extracting those values. So int ID is equal to cursor dot get int 0. String word is equal to cursor dot get string. So we're going to get the word and we're going to get the definition. So now I have those three pieces. I can now actually create a Word object. So here, oh, I'm missing little equals. Here I'm going to add that to the list now. So results dot add. I'm going to add a new Word object. I'm going to pass in the ID, the word, and the definition. So using the SQLite database class, there's really no connection between our Word model that we're using and the actual SQLite database. It doesn't know about it. So it doesn't know that in the database it's underscore ID, whereas in our model it's just ID. If we're using Room, then we do have to worry about it a little bit. But at least for this initial version, it actually doesn't matter that they're potentially different because of how I'm reading them in. All right. So once I've read all that data in, I can finally at the end say return results. Yeah, Room's a little bit different. So before Room came along, used to be how we did everything with SQLite helper. With SQLite. So Room's definitely made things a little bit easier to work with. But I wanted to give you at least some intro to the tools that kind of underlie Room and the way that we used to do it, so that these things kind of make sense. So there is my get all words method. Okay, so if you're at this point, if you got all that running, please post something in chat so we can go back to, so we can start hooking this up and showing the actual results in the UI. Okay. All right. So we've got this wordless database class, but we haven't hooked it up anywhere to the app yet. So if I go back to my main activity, I'm also going to open up the layout. If I look at what's in the layout right now, there's just a single text view. I do want to use that text view to display the output. I'm going to use that here. I could put this into a recycler view if we wanted to do a more kind of complete example, but I want to do just a simple example here right now. So in this case, I'm going to go ahead and make this take up the full space by switching this up to match constraints. There we go. So now my text view is taking up the entire screen. Let me actually put a little bit of margin around it. So we're going to set the margins to 16. There we go. Okay. And I need to give this an ID. So maybe we just give this an ID of text underscore view. Okay. Because this is going to be where I show my output. Okay, that's all I'm doing with the layout. It's just a very simple text view where I'm going to show the data that's in the database. Okay, so in here, I'm going to add a variable for the database object. So private word list database. I'm going to call that MDB or MDatabase. Okay, and on create equals new word list database. This, because we need to give it a context, so that's going to be the activity. And then going into displaying that, I also need to grab the text view, private text view. I'll enter. So mTextView is equal to find view by ID r.id.textView. Okay. So I've got the text viewer where I want to display the text, and I've got a database. Okay. Now we want to actually go use the method that we just created to retrieve all the words. So list word. This is going to be the words. Did I do that? Yep. Okay. All right. So dbm database dot get all words. Okay. So that's going to retrieve all the words, and then I can loop through and display them. So let me build up let me create a string builder here. And call this output equals new string builder. And then I'm going to loop through each of the words in turn. So word, word, and words. Okay, so we got a simple for each loop there. And then I'm going to spit it into the output. So output dot append. I'm going to use a string format here. So let's say we want to show the ID %. So that's going to be a number, %d, %s, comma, %s. And then into that, actually I want a /n at the end to end the line. And then in there, I'm going to add in the 3 different properties. So word get ID, word dot get word, word dot get definition. Okay, so that's going to add each of the words as a separate line into that output string builder. And then I'm finally going to show it. So at the end of all this, I'm going to say mTextView dot set text, and we're going to set that to the output. All right, let's give that a try. Something's not right. So where did I crash? Clear. Okay. So it says on create locked. Word list table has 3 columns, but 2 values were supplied. Oh, okay. So my insert statements failed. My insert statements are wrong. So in word list database line 28, so it failed to run that. So what I need to do instead, because it's expecting 3 columns instead of 2, I need to specify that I want to insert only the word and the definition. There we go. That's what was missing. Okay, so we've got data being displayed. The next thing I may want to do is add sort of a similar method to get just a single row based on the ID. So we went through this, which gives us an example of getting all of the words from the database. I'm also going to add a method to get a specific word. So public word get word by ID. So int ID. Okay, so I want to get a word knowing its specific ID. So I need to create a select statement there. So string query is equal to select ID word definition from word list table where underscore ID is equal to question mark. So that's my query. Okay. Now I need the args array. So that has to be a string array. Args is equal to new string array. And I want to create that with a literal array. Now I'd like to put the ID in there. Notice, however, that my ID is an integer, so I just need to convert it to a string. So string dot value of ID. Okay, that will convert that into a string. And then I can do kind of the same thing that I did previously. So I'm going to open up a connection to the database. I want a readable database. Okay. And then I'm going to try to run the query. Try cursor equals db.get raw query. Raw query, this time I'm going to pass in the query and the args rather than null, because I do want to replace this question mark here with the ID. And then what I'm going to end up producing is a single word object. So here I'm going to say if cursor dot move to first. So if there is a row, then that's going to return true, and then I can parse that word. And if it's not there, then I'm going to end up returning null. So int ID is equal to cursor dot get int 0 string word is equal to cursor dot get string 1 string word definition is equal to cursor dot get string 2. Okay, Okay, so that gives me all the properties of that row. Oh, I don't need that because I already know what ID the word should have. It's complaining that I have the same thing twice. So here I'm going to just return that word. So return new word. And this is going to be the ID, the word, and the definition. Otherwise, if I don't successfully find a word, I'm just going to return null at the end. So if there is no word with that ID, I'm going to end up down here. If I do find a word with that ID, I'm going to end up here. So you can kind of see that they're very similar, but one is how do I get the results if I'm expecting more than one result? And this is what do I do if I'm expecting just one result to come back from the query. So we can test that also in main activity. I can display that out. Let me add that into the output. So let's say word 2 is equal to db m database dot get word by ID. Let's pass in 2, and then I'm going to add that to the output. So output dot append string dot format. I'm going to use the same format I have here. I also want to add another line in there to explain what this is. So /n found word /n. Let's run that. Here we go. So we can see we got all the words, and then we can see that we were able to find a single word based on its ID. Now, let's say I wanted to try this with an ID that isn't there, right? So we know that 10 isn't there. Let's go ahead and try this. We're going to see as it crashes. Well, because word 2 is now null. So what I want to do typically if I'm going and grabbing an item from the database, I do need to check that it actually is or isn't null. So I'm going to say word does not equal null. So if it's not null, then let's go ahead and display it as found. Otherwise, I'm going to show word not found. Yeah, so they're not connected. The database that we created in SQL Expert, that's just kind of how to show you how to use that tool. That's not actually at all connected. I could have just started this in Android Studio directly if I knew how to write all the code. If I knew how to write all the SQL myself, I could have just written this directly and skipped SQLite Expert completely. So it's not something you have to use. Yeah. So one thing you may want to do is pull down the database that's on the device. So to do that, I've got to remember where that is. We need to have the devices window open. I think that's in AWD Manager. I remember it's kind of buried. View details. Nope, that's not what I want. Here. No, okay. I need to pull that up. I wrote that down last semester, how to get there. I need to look up the documentation that I created last year for that. Here we go. Found it. So I'm going to download as PDF document. And then add that in here. Okay. There we go. So, open the project in Android Studio, and we're going to go to Tool, Windows, Device File Explorer. Is that right? View, Tool, Windows, Device File Explorer. There we go. Device File Explorer. So this is the window you want to have open. You'll see I have my Nexus S pre-selected here. So this will let me get to all of the files that are actually on the device. So I want to go into the folder where it's going to be at is data, the name of your app, /databases. So we talked about internal storage in 9.0. That's what we're talking about here. So data / your app name is your internal storage folder. Okay. So if we go in here, data, and the name of my app is edu Rankin PR Smith SQLite example. Yours will probably be different, but I can scroll down looking for it there. So edu Rankin, We're going to expand the database folder, and there you can see there's an example.db file. Okay, that's the file I want. If you can't see that folder, it may be because you've opened this already. It doesn't automatically update. So you may need to right-click one of the folders, say the data folder, and click synchronize to get it to refresh. But I have this here. I can right-click on this file and I can click Save As. I'm going to save the example DB. Why don't I save it to my desktop? Okay. Errors downloading the file. Okay, it succeeded that time. There we go. So now if I double click that file, here, wait a second. Is that right? Let me close all these databases to make sure I'm not seeing one that I've already seen. Okay, so I pulled it down. There's an Android metadata folder. What am I missing? Save as. Let me synchronize first. So synchronize, save as. Yes, I want to replace it. It successfully loaded it. But yet I'm not seeing the table I created. Do I need to leave the app? I feel like I'm missing a step. I've got to be missing something because the table's not there. I've got example DB here, but I don't have the table. Clearly the data's in the database. Am I saving it to a different directory than I think I am? Let's delete that. Oh, Android's. That's keeping it open, so let's make sure I have that closed. Save as, desktop. I must be missing something. I'm not sure what it is, but that's typically how you're going to pull it down. Is you'll find it in data. It'll be here, and then pull it down to your device. Pull it down to your computer to open it. Maybe, I'm not sure. I think I stopped the app. What if I restart the Android device? What if I shut down this emulator and do a power reboot on it? So restart. Data. Databases. Save as. I'm going to save that to my desktop. To replace it. Yes. So the problem is I'm only getting a metadata folder and a metadata table, and there should be that word list table there, and I'm not sure why that is. Why is there this table but there's no word list table? May have to investigate that further. Does anybody have any questions at this point with kind of how this works? Maybe. I don't know if he'll want to come on stream or not. And see if we can coax him into it. Hey, Watson, come on.
What's she doing?
Come back. Watson, here's a treat.
More treats? Do you want some treats? You want some treats? What? He's a good boy. He's a good boy. He's a good boy.
He knows that strange things are happening.
He's like, you're tricking me. Got treats. Oh?
No? Well, he's like, now you have to move forward so that he can get closer to him. Because you're his ride. Anyway, that's the cat. Wave hi. And he's gone. All right. So we're going to call that a day. And then we'll get started with room and all the interesting stuff that goes into 10.1 with view models and those kind of pieces. A lot of what's in 10.1 is very similar to things that we did with Entity Framework, as well as some things. The view models are kind of similar to how WPF works, or Windows Presentation Framework. So it's a very different way to how to structure your applications. There is quite a bit in 10.1, but 10.1 is really the last lesson in this particular course, portion of the course. I do want to do some stuff with Volley, just do some maybe some refresher on Volley and talking about Firebase once we finish it. But that's really it. From there, we'll be working on the final project. So I anticipate having one more hands-on text in the next week or so. But from there, final projects. So don't forget to start on your second draft of your project proposal. It's due, I think, on the 17th. So you got a bit over a week to do that. But just keep that in mind. Next week's probably, if you can get that started this week, definitely start on it. But it's going to be due on the 17th. All right. So with that, that's a wrap for today. I'm going to end the stream and catch you on Discord should you have any more questions.